The Brooklyn Vegan Show is a podcast about music brought to you by the music blog and online record store Brooklyn Vegan. Make sure to subscribe to hear all of our upcoming episodes featuring interviews with musicians and more, and find us 24/7 at brooklynvegan.com, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Hey, welcome to the new episode of the Brooklyn Vegan Show. I'm BV editor Andrew Sacker, and today's episode is an interview with author Chris Payne, who just put out his new book, Where Are Your Boys Tonight? The Oral History of Emo's Mainstream Explosion, 1999 to 2008. Chris is someone I've communicated with here and there over the years on Twitter and other social media, but this was really the first time I got to sit down with him and talk at length, and it was an awesome conversation. Before this book, Chris was a staff writer at Billboard for many years. He's also written for Alt Press, Stereo Gum, and more. And he grew up in New Jersey as the emo explosion was happening all around him. And he gets into how both that upbringing and his career as a writer led to him putting out this awesome book. I highly recommend reading the book if you haven't. If you care at all about emo, especially its popular era in the 2000s, this really covers so much, from the really visible stuff like Fall Out Boy and My Chemical Romance to underrated things like The Last Silent Majority Show on Long Island. It's a really cool book, and I really recommend it to fans of this style of music. Chris talks a lot about the book throughout this conversation, and we also just kind of shoot the breeze about the emo explosion. Chris has so many interesting things to say, so much interesting perspective on this era, both from living through it and learning so much more about the depths of it while conducting the many interviews that he conducted for this book. It's all really cool stuff, and I was really honored to have Chris on the show. Before we get to that chat, just a quick mention that listeners of the Brooklyn Vegan podcast can get 30% off of their first year's membership at DistroKid by signing up at distrokid.com/VIP/BrooklynVegan. That link's also included in the description of this episode, and you can click directly from there. If you're unfamiliar with DistroKid, it's an awesome service for musicians that allows you to easily upload your music to all major streaming platforms, including Spotify, Apple Music, and more. DistroKid allows you to do automatic revenue splits so collaborators and co-writers can get paid too. It provides you with an artist page that links to your music on all streaming services. It allows you to add lyrics, credits, and liner notes, and more. Again, get 30% off by signing up at distrokid.com/VIP/BrooklynVegan. And now, my chat with Chris Payne. What's up, Chris? How you doing?
Good. Just did a bunch of radio interviews, like one after another this morning, which is kind of different. I'd never done that before. Like for like just a station in Minneapolis and like a rock station in like North Carolina. Just pretty, like each one was like 6 minutes long, and these like radio guys just like going through questions real fast and pretty fun. Pretty different thing for me. I think podcasts are a lot more my speed, but that was cool.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I have no experience with radio, but I mean, we're tapping back into third wave emo, so you got to take it back to radio, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Um, well, I'm excited to chat. I've got my Bleed American shirt on,
Oh sick.
um, freshly purchased at a Jason Fest.
Oh sick. Yeah, I was there and I saw people wearing that and I thought it was sick, but then I saw the merch lines and I was like, "Oh man."
It was insane. I don't know why I decided it was worth it, but the group I was with was like, let's just all do it together. And I was like, all right, fair enough.
Yeah, if you're going to do it in a group, at least you got
Yeah,
people to talk to.
exactly. So, yeah, we're chatting about your new book, Where Are Your Boys Tonight? The Oral History of Emo's Mainstream Explosion, 1999 to 2008. So, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background as both an emo lover and a music journalist, and how you came to write a book on emo?
Yeah, so it really starts with where I grew up. I grew up in a town called Colonia in New Jersey, kind of on the north side. And this scene was just like huge where I grew up. So I went to high school between '02 and '06. So by this point, bands like Save Today and Thursday had kind of already made their mark. So shit was popping. It wasn't like this still like on the come up. It was, looking back, it was such a mainstream version of punk rock. Like it kind of was weird to me at the time because I had some sense of like what came before. But now thinking back, like how like vinyl like is obviously so big now, but I never really saw vinyl being sold at shows, and I didn't really know anyone who did zines, but like all my friends were really into writing about shows they went to on like Zanga or like obviously MySpace. So it was it was kind of weird growing up in a place where it was going to these like hole in the wall venues like Hamilton Street Cafe and Bloomfield Avenue Cafe in Jersey, and like Starland Ballroom was obviously a staple. But it was also like blowing up, and that's what I tried to capture in the book. Because also going back, so I didn't play in a band myself, but there were so many bands back then. And my good buddy, his name's Greg Scalera, he played in a band called Moraine, who kind of sounded like Motion City Soundtrack and the Get Up Kids. He played synth in this band, and they were a staple in the local scene from like '05 through '07, and they would open for like legit touring bands when they came through. And like I saw my buddy opening for Gym Class Heroes and Paramore when I was like a senior in high school. Like that's crazy. And he got to be buds with Haley back then. Like we'd all be, me and my friends would be playing like Guitar Hero in someone's living room, and Greg would just be like on the phone chatting with Haley about tour or whatever. Like such crazy stuff thinking back, but like seeing your friends do stuff like that is pretty wild, and it was a lot of what just made me think like, oh, someone like me could do this thing.
So how did you first start to write about music?
So it started at this newspaper called the Home News Tribune, which is based out of New Brunswick. They had a weekly teen page that like high schoolers wrote for. It was called Teen Scene, which is funny to think about now. And I started off there because I was always like interested in like writing and journalism. Like I wrote for the middle school paper, but that was kind of just like playtime. And so at first I was writing just general interest stuff. Like I wrote a thing about taking your driver's test. Uh, and I pitched and wrote a story on MySpace when it was first coming up in 2004. And I was getting really into this music. And I basically became like the music reviews guy for this teen section, teen scene at the Home News Tribune. And that led to college radio. I was music director at TCNJ from '08 to 2010, and did a lot of writing for the campus newspapers there, for the station WTSR. Shout out to them. Did a lot of writing for their blog, and that fortuitously led to interning at Billboard and then Pitchfork after I graduated, which is pretty lucky because, again, like I just feel so closely tied to Jersey, and a lot of it is because like those were unpaid internships back then. And I never would have been able to do that if I didn't live so close to the city. Like my parents live like a 45-minute train ride from the city, so I would just like pack a lunch and take the train in. And that like never would have happened if I lived anywhere else. So I was just like interning, first Billboard, then Pitchfork. Then briefly I had this like random paid job in the city doing logging for Bravo shows. Funny thing, that was on my resume for a bit. And then Billboard hired me as an editorial assistant in 2013, which is sick. I finally got to move to the city. This was kind of like in my phase of really hiding still a lot of like my emo and post-hardcore beginnings. Probably something that you can sympathize with to some extent. I don't think there was like, now that I think about it, I don't think there was any real reason to be like afraid, but I just kind of caught a drift of like, what's, if you want to like get a job at one of these places, indie rock's the way to go. But also I was like really passionate about that stuff. And like, and then around like 2008, 2009, when I was doing the radio station, I was feeling a little old for a lot of like the really, neon pop punk stuff and like the MySpace metalcore that was kind of like the next version of the scene. So I was, going through my Animal Collective and like Grizzly Bear and M83 phase, getting into rap against a pop. And it was around, I'd say, 2013 when I started Billboard, when Fall Out Boy and Paramore both put out big albums. Fall Out Boy was Save Rock and Roll, Paramore self-titled with, Ain't It Fun, Still Into You, best Paramore album in my opinion. So I got to build relationships with those bands, interview them, and then started warming up to like where the genre was in 2013, 2014. I was definitely a few years late to the whole emo revival thing, but I remember Turnover's album, Peripheral Vision. I premiered that one and actually went back to this story a couple years ago when I was seeing like, I guess it was last, or that album was 2014, right?
I think it was 2015.
So the 10 year hasn't even
Yeah,
happened yet. But
right.
I went back to it for some reason. I was like, oh, cool. I interviewed Turnover for that and premiered that. That's pretty cool. So Billboard then was when I started to get back into where the genre was at in the mid 2010s, get into some new bands, and also just interview a lot of these 2000s bands. Like I said, Fall Out Boy, Paramore, Brendan Urie, Panic at the Disco, and there were two oral histories I did for Billboard that I really enjoyed that got a really good response. One of them was about A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, the first Panic at the Disco album for the 10-year anniversary. And the other was about the 2005 Warped Tour, when Fall Out Boy and MCR were on it. By far the biggest year for Warped Tour, biggest attendance. That piece was super fun to write. So I got laid off from Billboard in March of 2020, early in the pandemic, a bunch of other people at Billboard. So I was like, it's a wild day. I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? It's funny because like it's such a like a harrowing day, but also when you get laid off, there's just like all this attention you're getting, like all these people reconnecting with you and tweeting at you and saying nice things. So my head was in a million different places, and then the day after I got laid off, I got this email. And the subject headline is Pete Wentz, and it was just this email saying like, "Hey man," like it was just like words of encouragement, and I was like, "Is this really?" Is because we had interviewed a lot, but I had never spoken to him in email or anything. So I was like, "Is someone fucking with me? Maybe like what is this?" So Gabe Saporta I knew pretty well, so I just texted him, and it was like, "Gabe, like, is this really Pete Wentz? Is this his email?" And he's like, "Well, read me the email." And he's like, "Yeah, that's Pete." So I was like, sick, and said, "Thanks, Pete." We got to talking, and that turned into the first ask for an interview for my book, which I kind of wanted to write for a long time, but couldn't really do when I was staff at Billboard. So that became the focus of my time during lockdown. Just lots of Zoom conversations with emo men. Not just men, but this era is a lot of men. Long
Yeah.
conversations with emo dads. That's what it was. And that's basically how we got to where we are now.
Wow. No, I mean that's a pretty like great way to spend a pandemic and also to come out of like getting laid off. I mean,
Yeah, it's like I'm really fortunate it turned out that way, because I hate to like, there's all these like hustle stories about, that about getting laid off, and there were all these like corny tweets going on then about like, oh, Shakespeare wrote blah 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 when like he was in, I don't know, there
mhm.
were tweets like that. So never want to make it never want to spin it that way, which I've been being careful to in these interviews. But yeah, it was a cool time. Well, speaking of being careful in interviews, I don't think I want to call it cool time, but there was a lot of kindness for sure that I felt, and I think a lot of people were very understanding of people like myself who had lost their jobs and were willing to give a little bit of their time to help out. And a lot of these people were not on tour. None of them were on tour. So just a matter of time and place and following your passions, I guess, because there wasn't much else to do. That and like binge watching The Sopranos and Gilmore Girls. That was about it.
Two other really good things to do with a lot of extra time at home. I will say, just to go back to one of the things you said, I mean, I can fully relate to entering this world of music journalism and being like, okay, I have this emo past that I'm not supposed to talk about yet, or like, and obviously that changed over time, and like, but like, like, yeah, it was definitely the vibe back then, like entering the world of just the cool kid critic club. You felt like you were supposed to hate this stuff, and I mean, and that comes up in your book too. I mean, with like how much Pitchfork like was responsible for either trashing these bands or just pretending they didn't exist. And that was so influential. So I mean, I'm sure you felt similarly, but it took me a while. And also like, it wasn't just overnight. Like it'd be like, okay, I feel like now I can write about, I don't know, like an easier entry band might have been like Me Without You, like that. They're kind of indie rock. Like we could talk about them now, but like to get from that to like Taking Back Sunday, and to get from that to like My Chem, or like it was, like each one almost felt like a new hurdle of like, are the commenters going to hate me? Like,
Yeah, it felt like there were certain bands from the era of my book, only a select few, Me Without You being one of them, that were always acceptable. I feel, I mean, not to everyone, but I feel like Thursday and Jimmy Eat World were two of those where like you could talk about them in 2009 to someone who was really into the culture, and maybe there was like a little laugh, but it's like no one is gonna shit on Clarity, or like who is gonna shit on like Full Collapse. But at that time, I mean, pretty hard to find someone who's gonna come to bat for like Motion City Soundtrack or Under Oath. But I think it's just one of those things where people get older, and the people who take over the jobs in writing, or the jobs booking venues, or the jobs doing whatever else in the industry, they just become kids who were super passionate when they were 16. And people who were passionate about music in that era, so many of them were into this kind of music because for so many different reasons, emo, I think in just every era of the genre, it just attracts super, super obsessive, passionate people. And I say that in the best way because, like, I'm one of them.
yeah. And I think like for many of us, like it was the easiest introduction to underground music.
Sure.
Like, I mean, like Full Collapse was one of my first records that wasn't like Blink 182 level popular. And from there, it was pretty quick to get to like, a 90s Screamo record, or like, and then from there, maybe you're onto like an 80s hardcore record. Like it was like the quickest way to find everything that was outside of like, the mainstream, but it also had a foot in the mainstream. And so it's like, I think it just led a lot of people down the path that like, you know, finding that kind of music.
Yeah, I mean, you've got your Bleed American shirt on. I mean, I feel so so like lucky that they were the band that started it all for me. Like that was the first album I ever bought with my own money. And I basically went from 0 to 100 with music in general. Like before that, I was just a kid who downloaded songs off LimeWire or Napster that I heard on the radio. And then it was like, oh, this album, there's really good songs on it besides the singles. Like, oh, like, what a concept. you know? Uh Turns out not every album, the not radio songs are as good, turns out. But Jimmy Eat World is such the connective tissue of this, going back to the 90s, going back to, you know, the first and second wave bands that they were influenced by. you can't even call them a Midwest emo band because they're from like Arizona, but West emo bands. And they also wound up touring with Paramore and playing important shows with My Chemical Romance. So they are so much of them and Thursday. I think those two bands will come back to a lot for this because they very much feel like the connective tissue between underground and the music industry and pop and DIY, and for building a narrative that brings all of that together, I needed to have voices like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm curious how you felt, but like Bleed American was one of my first CDs too, actually before Full Collapse, but I didn't know they were an emo band. Like, because the middle was so big and they toured around that time with Blink and Green Day. And so I was like, they're a pop punk band. And I hadn't heard Clarity or Static Prevails. It was really finding like Full Collapse and Tell All Your Friends that I started to introduce myself to the word emo. And then when somebody was like, Jimmy Eat World is emo, I was like, that sounds nothing like Full Collapse and Tell All Your Friends. And then, of course, hearing Clarity and Static Prevails put it into perspective and learning about, Midwest emo. But when you first got Bleed American, like, did you know you were listening to emo?
Yeah, because I remember. So this this was definitely the era of the iTunes music store, but because me and like the whole family, we shared a computer, and my dad was like the main music guy, and instead of iTunes, he used Real Player, which people probably don't even know what that is now, but that was like a big media player back in the early 2000s. And in the Real Player music store, every band would come up with a genre next to them. And it was like automated when you played one of their songs from your library. And Jimmy Eat World just came up as the genre emo. And I was like, oh, sick. Because I remember like I was just starting to be friends with these kids in my high school. Actually, a bunch of kids who I'm still friends with today. A lot of them, I remember sitting behind them in a creative writing class, and they were talking about emo and like what it was, and kind of arguing, not really arguing, but like debating what it was. So right away I was like, oh, it's this like interesting thing, and there's all this like debate and like hot takes, and like, oh, is this an emo band? It's like, oh, does Yellow Card count as emo, or is Good Charlotte emo? Oh, Dashboard, that's definitely, like, they were saying this like back then. So right away I was like, and they were mostly older kids, so I was very intrigued. So right away I was like, oh, and it's like short for emotional. That sounds interesting. Right away, I was like, oh, it's this like interesting thing that like the cool older kids are talking about. So when I saw Jimmy Eat World was just what I was being told they were an emo band, I was just like, oh, sick.
That's awesome. Yeah. So, I mean, now you bring it up, I have to ask. I mean, one of the hardest things to do, especially if you're putting out a book about emo, is define emo. How do you define emo?
So, God, it's changed a lot over the years. Um, for me, approaching this book, I really used hardcore as a guide, and I would say kind of like a 1 degree of separation from hardcore. Because, a band like Panic at the Disco didn't exactly come from hardcore, but they came from Pete Wentz, and Pete Wentz, whether people know it or not, is hardcore as fuck. And also, side note, a funny thing they used to do at shows every once in a while, Brendan Urie would do this bit called Positive Hardcore, where him and the band, like right before or like during the encore, like, do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I've never heard about this.
Okay, this was like in the 2010s too. This was
Oh,
like not
wow.
even early, where Brendan Urie, after doing like some song off of Vices and Virtues, would just have his band play what sounded like, I don't know, like a Comeback Kid song, and just start screaming. And it was kind of like kind of like poking fun at it, but also you could tell he knew what was up. Like, so in a funny way, even Panic. So to get back to answering your question, which I could go on and on about for a long time, it was adjacency to hardcore, whether it was like, oh, straight up, this band was in the hardcore scene, or maybe they had a member who was in a hardcore band before they did their emo pop band. And later on, as you get into like the emo rap years of the 2010s. Like Lil Peep is one who I really highlight in the book. Things get a little bit more indirect with influence, and like, Lil Peep didn't exactly come up like in the hardcore scene. Like he came up in a lot of ways from the internet. But when you look at him like rapping over mineral samples and what a lot of his influences were and how much he loved MCR, it's like, yeah, that fits too.
Yeah, like I mean, someone like Peep maybe didn't come from hardcore, but like his influences are like firmly emo. So it's like I feel like emo can influence emo, right? Like
Yeah, totally. And honestly, like, and I think we all have to be kind of open with this stuff and reappraising things. Cause I remember when he started not really getting it and not being into it and kind of feeling like I wasn't angry. Like I wasn't someone who was like, what? He rapped over the mineral sample and without proper citation or royal. I wasn't like that. But also I was like, oh, like why is Pitchfork calling him emo? But they won't, they won't cover whoever's new album. But in time, I think it's understandable why someone who's passionate about a genre gets that way. But I think it's important for all of us to just kind of like listen to the kids, because if it's just a sign that your genre that you're passionate about is like important and meaningful, that it's connecting with the new generation who's going to, of course, do their own spin on it. If genres don't do that, they just kind of wither and die out.
yeah, I mean, I definitely went through the same thing with Peep. I almost word for word said what you just kind of yeah. And honestly, like I'm like mad at myself because after he passed, I really saw how special he was, and I'm like, damn, I wish I got that right away. Um, but yeah, like I feel the same. I mean, I don't know. Like I had a point in my life where I would have looked you straight in the eye and said, "My Chem is not an emo band." They're like a pop punk band with eyeliner who later on wanted to be Queen. Like they're not an emo band, but like I don't know, they definitely are. Like
And in
but
2006, they would have looked you in the eye and agreed with you. They hated it. They hated being
right,
cool with that. But then I was like chatting on the phone with Mikey Way, and he's just like calling themselves an emo band. It's
yeah.
kind of crazy because I never would have predicted things to turn out that way.
And I think over time it's just easier to not argue about it, like
Yes.
like if it's just kind of like, oh, like when we were young is an emo nostalgia festival, like you don't got to start picking out like, well, no, not if this band's on it. It's just easier to say that and then everybody's like, I know what you mean and now we can move on.
Yeah, and that was a blast. I got out to I was there for the first weekend, and I mean seeing MCR and Paramore headline was sick. And also one of my favorite memories with the book, like, so this was back in October of last year, so the book was still 8 months away, but like some of the people I interviewed, they knew, and obviously knew about it. So like in the press area, like doing some interviews in between sets, chatting with some people from bands who I interviewed, like Karaba from Dashboard and Anthony from Bayside, Zach from Jimmy Eat World, like them coming up and chatting to me and saying like, "Hey, like excited about the book. We were just talking about it." It was like one of the first times it kind of felt like a real thing, and thinking about it now, that just feels really special.
That's amazing. So something I want to ask is, like you said, you lived through a lot of this stuff in real time, especially living in New Jersey. But what were some of the surprising things you learned when doing interviews for the book?
Huh. It's one of these things where, so like for instance, reading, like when I read American Hardcore, that book, I read that for the first time when I was writing my book, and it's like I knew obviously like hardcore back then was super violent, but from reading the book, I was like, oh my god, this is so much more violent and scary than I ever thought it was from reading the specifics. So I like from my book, I always knew this stuff was huge and made a lot of money, but just learning about how much cash was being thrown around, that was pretty wild. So like I really got into it on the chapter on Warped Tour in '05. That was the year that Warped by far made the most money. it was the only year that they made money off ticket sales because they normally just made money off promotions and but this year, places were getting completely overflowed. So there was one date MCR sold $60,000 worth of merchandise. That was in Detroit. They did Warped Tour at the Silverdome that year, just like a huge football stadium. And even bands like Motion City Soundtrack, Hawthorne Heights, they were selling $30,000 worth of merch in a day. Like one crazy quote, Josh, the guitarist from Motion City, was telling me he was in New York walking around with a backpack with $120,000 in cash wadded up inside it, trying to deposit it somewhere. Because on Warped Tour, the venues are in the middle of nowhere, so there's no banks to drop off this money. So this dude who's probably never touched anything close to that much money in his life is just walking around with this $120,000 backpack. Probably like the teller is gonna think he's a drug dealer. The people in bands literally told me like they thought we were that. But yeah, the amount of cash being thrown around that astounded me.
It definitely is nuts. And like, I mean, even just thinking about how truly popular this stuff was, and like, I don't know, like, just like there's still like, it is a form of like punk rock, and you feel like they're regular people and you know them, and like they're not rock stars except maybe like Pete Wentz. But just kidding. But like it just, you're like, yeah, reading that is like, wow, like these were like, I don't know, it just, to put into perspective of like, these people were on major labels, they were on television, there was like tons of money being thrown around, and it's just sometimes, especially after all these years, and then you go see these bands now and they're mostly a bit smaller, you kind of forget like how much of a gigantic thing it was.
Yeah, and also I learned even more detail about how so many of these bands came from very, traditional punk, like actual punk backgrounds. Like I remember when I was like researching for stuff, seeing this flyer, and one of Midtown's first shows was opening for You and I in the Thursday Basement. I was like what the fuck? Like what would it have been like to be at one of those shows? Because I mean, like, man, and also another thing that I thought was really fun about doing this book was asking these people in bands questions about the other bands that they'd probably never been asked. Because so much of the press that we read from Fall Out Boy or Paramore or whoever, it's tied to an album release, whether it was, 2006 or 2004 or whatever. So typically they're not being asked about other bands unless it's like a really obvious connection. So back in the early days, especially of this book, when the scene hadn't truly broken yet and everyone was like super connected, not famous, playing each other's shows, some of the best stories and quotes came from like asking Chris Carrabba about Midtown in New Jersey, or asking Mikey Way about Taking Back Sunday on Long Island, or, even within Florida, asking Aaron from Under Oath about Chris Carrabba and Dashboard, who are, you would think, were kind of a generation ahead of Under Oath, but not really, because they both started. Actually, Under Oath started before Dashboard. So just hearing these stories, like in real time in the 2020s, getting to ask these bands questions that you would always kind of wanted to ask if you were a huge nerd about the genre, that was really fun for me.
Yeah, stuff was awesome to read for sure. And I liked the times that people might be a little honest about like, we hated this, and like usually like they're like, but we warmed to it later, or like we saw that what they were doing. But it's always nice to get that kind of honesty in there too.
Yeah, I mean, with the Panic at the Disco stuff, that that's kind of at the core of it. Because I mean, when Fever hit and when they came out, that was such like a, everyone had to have like a hot take on Panic at the Disco. Most people who were the loudest, who you heard online, or sometimes in person, but usually it was online, like people hated them. What's funny is most of this stuff is all gone, but punknews.org, they're like the one site where all of their news posts from like 2004 are all still live. So you can go back and read like the comments section on a Fall Out Boy Academy is post from 2004. And yeah.
Yeah, it's brutal. I've definitely read like old reviews, and then the comments are just like, you would have thought that everybody hated every band just based on the
Right.
punk news comments.
Things are so much nicer now, which I think is cool. But yeah, back then things were just meaner, you know? And I think some people kind of just rolled off their backs, but doing the book, I learned like how much of a mark it really did leave on people. Both the term emo and just all like the backlash and the negative reviews and the stuff they got from it, whether it was from older punks or just people on the outside who just like were always shitting on it.
I love the Fat Mike quote you have where he
Yes.
calls emo younger kids that don't have a very good sense of melody.
Yo, I was so psyched to get Mike to chat for this. Shout out to Kevin Lyman for connecting us. That one felt like it really brought the book together, getting the voice of someone from the previous generation who just was very skeptical, let's say, of the bands in my book. And, still pretty much is. But yeah. Real ones remember 2006 Warped Tour, Under Oath versus Fat Mike. What a story that one was. That was a hot one.
That was definitely something I learned about reading the book. I had not known about it.
Yeah, I knew Under Oath was a big thing, but none of my friends like listened to that stuff. Like I like from reading, like AP and from reading like having like Warped Tour comps. Like I knew all like the skate punk bands from the '90s. But I was just like so by '06 I was just like support the scene, like Jersey scene, like through and through. Like I was a senior in high school. It was just before I started to like get into indie rock. So I was just like, had a car then and like all my friends had cars, going to shows all the time. And like Under Oath, like were one of my favorite bands. And it was just like, fuck this. What's this? Obviously now I can look back on it with more nuance and see how Fat Mike was not just being a dick, but being critical of them because of them being very publicly Christian at a time when Christians are still doing this, but when Christians were being very unfriendly to the LGBTQ community, and there was definitely some meaning behind Fat Mike's words, and then things kind of spun and went in a whole different direction.
Yeah, as happens with Fat Mike, I think.
Yeah.
Um, are there any like I don't know if you don't have to answer this, but are there any bands that back then like you would have shit on, but now you're like, you know what, I see it, I like them now.
Hmm. Maybe, so first off, maybe not shit on, but I definitely was not a huge fan of the Used. And doing the book, I got into their self-titled debut, and I was like, this album rules. Like this album is polished and pop, but like the low end is so heavy and dirty. It's just that perfect balance. And Bert's voice in the album is just like incredible. Like I saw like back in the day, I knew Taste of Ink, and I didn't really know much of anything else. But going back and getting into like Maybe Memories, Blue and Yellow, Box of Sharp Objects, Buried Myself Alive, it's like there's a handful. Also, the hidden track at the end of the album, which goes so hard. And then getting into their story of the Used coming up as these like punk kids in this super dangerous Utah hardcore scene where things are just wild. And, Bert being like homeless for a time and struggling with addiction, and the other guys being kind of in this like goofy new metal rock band that didn't really know what direction they wanted to go in, and John Feldman discovering them, and like it's like they went from no one caring about them, not even like indie labels, just like no one caring about them, to them just being shopped to every major label, and then like a year later, Bert being on the Osbournes. Like from doing the book, I definitely developed a real appreciation for the Used, because as far as like, MCR is the band on the cover. MCR seen by a lot of people as like the pinnacle of the scene in the Black Parade. I think Thursday is very rightfully credited as, the band that helped make MCR. But I think the other half of that is the Used. The Used took them on pretty much every tour they did from 2003 like into 2005. The Used were a huge band on MTV before MCR was. The Used had a similar sound that they got, mainstream radio program directors and shit like that to warm to. And a lot of times it's like the first or second thing through the door that kind of makes it through but gets kind of bloody and doesn't quite make it, and it's the third thing that gets through, or the third or the fourth thing that kind of is the thing that gets through the door. And with MCR, I kind of think, yeah, Thursday for sure, but the other half of that is the Used, and I think I'd really try to give them their shine in the book.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I think like when you really learn a band's story, it can like, you know, just make you appreciate it a lot more than if you're just like, oh, like they had a song on the radio and I didn't really listen to it that much, you know.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there was anyone else I really didn't like who I came around to in the book. I mean, to be honest, I kind of started off as like a mall kid more than like a hardcore kid, and got into hardcore more in like the 2010s and like now. So most of the stuff that I really liked as a kid was a lot of, not all of it, but a lot of the stuff I liked as a kid was the stuff that like older people made fun of. So I think like a lot of the stuff in the book is just me coming back around again to a band that I maybe was passionate about, kind of deleted from my iTunes library and disowned, and then rediscovered.
I think that's like a fairly natural progression. Especially when like maybe I don't know how you feel, but like those older people's voices, you start to internalize them, I think, and then they start to like you're like, oh, I can't like this. I need to be cool. And then I think, if you're lucky, because maybe not everybody, but I think ideally you hit a point where you're like, fuck those voices. Like I can listen to whatever the hell I want. And a lot of these bands made really good music. And
Yeah, I mean, for me, I wish I had had that like coming around moment sooner. Because, like I said, I did college radio through '08 well, I started college in 2006. So I did, I was music director of the station from '08 to 2010, but I did, a show all 4 years. And that was just such a pop in time for like Pitchfork indie. This is like, Dirty Projectors, Bita Orca, and Grizzly Bear, Vecca Timest, and Phoenix, and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, It's Blitz, LCD Sound System. There were just so many great indie albums being made at that time, and it was kind of an easy way to transition from the more like emo stuff to just being like pitchfork pilled. But also like I'm not just saying this, but I remember like getting like the Thursday, there was like Thursday did a split with this band Envy, and putting that into rotation and being like, yeah, like I don't care what like the indie kids think, like I can still rep Thursday. Like Thursday is cool. Maybe if it was like, you know, I'm sure we probably got CDs from like Mayday Parade or whoever. Probably wouldn't have put those in. But no shots at Mayday Parade, but just like for me at that time, I was like, okay, there's some emo bands that I can get away with at college radio. And like obviously Thursday, I've always rode for Thursday.
yeah, no, I mean, hell yeah. But yeah, I mean, like super, super relatable. Like my freshman year of college was 2009. So yeah, it was like the Merriweather Post Pavilion, Vecca Mist year. And like that was everything. And that was what everybody liked. And especially being a freshman in college, you like super need to feel accepted. So I was like not telling everybody I was also listening to Newfound Glory's new album,
Mm-hmm.
like, but um, you come around and you start to be more honest with yourself, I think. And I agree that Thursday were always, when they put out No Devolution, I was like, oh, they're like making a record that matters now, and I feel so strongly that it is cool, and I feel no shame. Um, and then they broke up.
Yeah. Man, do you think we'll ever get new Thursday music?
I hope, but I think that especially with like Ellis Dunes and No Devotion and stuff, I think that they're not going to put out a record unless it really works for them. And my guess is right now nothing has, because you know they just keep touring and playing old stuff, and meanwhile they're all making music. So, but I think if they ever like if it ever clicks, I think they're a band who could make an actually good record. So I hope that that moment comes.
An actually good record.
Well, you know, I mean, not every band, you know, I mean, they're going to be what? They're going to be like, they're probably turning 25 as a band this year, right? Like, so, um, anyway, let me ask you something else about the book. You cover tons of bands and albums in the book, but if you touched on every single significant one, it would have been at least 5,000 pages. So, what's a particular band or record that you would have liked to highlight, but it just had to be left out?
It would have been really interesting to get into Me Without You. They're not in the book at all, and not because I don't like them, but hate to put them on the spot because there's a bunch like this. But I mean, for the narrative of the book, it's in a lot of ways the story of, well, obviously the story of emo, but the two main characters who I looked at it as the narrative, you know, almost like a movie. The main characters were MCR and Fall Out Boy. And there's so many bands that kind of connect on that constellation somewhere. You know, in chapter 2, I get the Get Up Kids in there because there was this like legendary show at this Elks Lodge in Jersey that the Get Up Kids came through on tour, along with At the Drive-In, who I got in at this juncture also because they were playing this Jersey show. It was the Through Being Cool release show with Saves the Day and Midtown, one of their first shows. So I had to kind of, with the narrative of this book, almost like a movie, kind of fit bands into the narrative somewhere. Because it would have been really jarring to just be like, okay, here's this chapter on this band from Pennsylvania who aren't really touring with any of the other bands in the book, but they're really cool. So here's a chapter on them. And then the next chapter, you know, we're back to Fall Out Boy. But yeah, Me Without You is one of those bands where they could just be a whole nother book in themselves because they really sounded like no one else. Like we were saying, they were one of the bands that came out of this era that really transcended it, and to those who knew, like never stopped being cool. You know, it seems like they really broke up on their own terms and did it their own way. Um, got to interview them on one of the Paramore cruises though. Probably one of the weirdest, in a good way, the weirdest interviews I've ever done, interviewing Me Without You in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But yeah, it would have been cool to get some of the more like indie rock leaning emo in the book, but like we were saying, if you don't focus in, it kind of goes from a story to an encyclopedia. And the book, you know, it was a story, not an encyclopedia of emo. So did my best. Did my best to include what I could, but like I said, it really is the story of mainstream emo and the, you know, Paramore and Panic at the Disco, Taking Back Sunday, Jimmy Eat World, Dashboard, they're big in there too. But through the bands being really there through the entire period of my book that it kept coming back to were Fall Out Boy and My Chemical Romance.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's no argument that those are like, you know, they took emo as far as it, well, maybe at this point Paramore, but like, I think in the timeline of the book, those for sure were like, but I do love how you give a lot of space, like you were saying with the Get Up Kids, like you give space to some of these like really like legendary, important underground bands that did like. I love that you have a whole chapter on Silent Majority because it's like you can't talk about Long Island emo without their influence, and you can't talk about mainstream emo without Long Island emo. And yet, still in 2023, I just feel like they've like kind of never got their due. Like I feel like even Cap and Jazz has more got their due than Silent Majority.
Yeah, and Silent Majority were like, in a way, like a New York City band, even though they weren't. It's still like from like kind of a part of their Long Island, so like really close to the city. Would get close to 1,000 people at their shows on Long Island at their peak. So it's yeah. I mean, I first like I didn't really know about them. I remember until uh it was when Movie Life got back together and I was interviewing them for Billboard, Vinny and Brendan, and I was researching and like found like their influence. Oh, this band, Silent Majority, and also like they like just I think unprompted they were just bringing them up a lot in the interview, and listening to their album Life of the Spectre, the Silent Majority full length. I was like, fuck, this album is so good, and also like in some of the lyrics. You just listen to them and you're like, oh, Taking Back Sunday rips this off so hard.
Yeah, I mean all those bands did. I love like where you highlight like their final show and how like every famous Long Island band had at least one member there, and like it's just like yeah, it's like you can visualize it. Like it's I felt like I was there reading it. Like it was awesome.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I really I wanted to like get like tell stories of things that people who are really into this music hadn't heard before because like so much of it needs to be told, but like people know it already. So, you try to tell it from a unique point of view, maybe get some different voices in the mix, have a different angle. But generally, if you're talking about like Paramore on the Shira Girl stage on Warped Tour, like that story's been told a billion times. So with Silent Majority within chapter 3, kind of introducing the Long Island scene, that felt really cool. And like interviewing Tommy, the singer of Silent Majority, was really rewarding. I'm so glad that he was down for an interview like this because I'm sure he doesn't do many interviews. Like he was just like chatting with me after a day of work. And also, which I kind of didn't even really know when I did the interview, but Tommy wound up working at Merch Direct, who he was a designer for so many of these shirts that wound up being sold at Hot Topic. That were just the shirts that probably you and I and so many other kids bought, just saw 1,000 times on that Hot Topic T-shirt wall because Tommy just came up in the Long Island scene. Aside from being the singer of the band, he was like a graffiti artist who also, could draw, could paint. So he just got doing band merch. So throughout the book, he is also a voice after Silent Majority breaks up. He's a voice later on in the book talking about all these t-shirts for like Taking Back Sunday that he's designing.
Yeah. It's wild too, just like how many of like the talking heads in the book are just like scenesters from the New Brunswick basement scene or the Long Island like hardcore scene that are now just like major players in the music world and have been for decades.
Yeah, I mean people like Paul Hanley, who works for French Kiss, who was like part of the Brunswick basement scene back in the day. Um Joanna Angel, who's a pretty famous adult film star, who has some of my favorite quotes in the book. Like this story about like a pseudo date that she went on with Jeff Rickley to an Elliott Smith show right before Thursday started. Um, I didn't get to interview him, but PJ Ransone, who played Ziggy on The Wire, is the guy passed out on the back cover of Through Being Cool on like the broken futon. He was around, like Sarah Lewis, who was a big player in Meet Me in the Bathroom. She was a DJ, had like a label that actually put out some emo bands. Sarah Lewis, Ultra Girl, probably a lot of people listening to this podcast know who she is. Her emo past was definitely not nearly as told as her Strokes garage rock past. She's one of a select club of people who were in both Meet Me in the Bathroom and my book, and Sarah has, I think, some of the best quotes in the whole thing.
Yeah, no, I mean like I feel like even back like I'm a little bit too young to have like experienced Ultra Girl in real time, but I've like heard the stories and hearing how she just like was fully on the Strokes thing, but also was like My Chemical Romance or the next Nirvana or something. I'm like, man, like she was doing back then what like I wish so many more people were doing. Like, so yeah, she seems
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, she really saw both sides of it, you know, how it all fit together.
Yeah.
And also, she was one of several people who stressed to me how much all these emo bands wanted to be the Strokes and Interpol.
Yeah, I mean, I like again, like it comes up with just like it's. I feel like it's hard, and then you also talk too about just like I think you talk about it, unless I'm in my head mixing up different things I've read, but like this stuff popped off in the suburbs, and the Strokes and stuff popped off in the city, and that is like a major factor, I think, as far as coolness and the perception of coolness.
Yeah, I mean, well, you can't change where you're from, you can't change where you're born, and you're just naturally going to be a product of your surroundings, as will the music you make. And it's funny because, like I said, I started high school in '02, so that was like when Strokes Is This It came out, and like I wasn't like super dialed in right away. You know, I wasn't reading like Cobra Snake, if that even existed in that year, in 2002. So I wasn't like, on top of everything, but I was, I was subscribing to magazines like obviously Alternative Press, but also Blender was a big one back then. Spin a little bit. My library always had Rolling Stones. Whenever I was like in the library at school killing time, I would read Rolling Stone. And it's like I could tell bands like the Strokes and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs were a thing, but they felt like they were a thing mostly in magazines. Whereas like at the lunch table or, just out in the world chatting with kids my age in Jersey, it just even not obviously like Fall Out Boy and MCR and Paramore were huge. I mean, what we're talking about is a little bit before Paramore, but in this early 2000s era, even a band like a really hyped Jersey band like Armor for Sleep or Senses Fail, like those bands in my like 15-year-old head just seems so much bigger than like the New York stuff because that's what all the people around me were passionate about. Like it was this like, looking back, it's so wild because going to a high school in Jersey back then, it wasn't just like punks or like emo kids. Like I remember like preppy kids listening to like Under Oath and Matchbook Romance. It was just so just of the youth growing up there then. And yeah, it's I just got kind of a funny, distorted version, like this world in New Jersey where it's like, oh yeah, like Senses Fail and Armor for Sleep and Hidden in Plain View, just like massive band.
Yeah, no, I mean, I know what you mean, and like one of the things I've talked about in the past is like I'm a little bit younger than you, and so I kind of got into the Strokes, Interpol, Franz Ferdinand, and stuff from like MTV,
Mhm.
and then like when I got a little older, and I was like, wait, like you're telling me those are the indie bands, and like Armor for Sleep is corny? I'm like, those are television bands, like those are like mainstream rock bands, like how are they the cool ones? Like, and I like them. I'm not at all like I was always a fan, but I thought that was like the mainstream rock that I liked, and Armor for Sleep was like the underground rock that I liked. So it got weird when I was like, then some internet like what is Max Bemis saying? Admit it, like the unspoken panel of like like they're telling me like, oh, Armor for Sleep is like that's corny fucking emo like fake punk bullshit, and I'm like, what? Like,
And then Armor for Sleep went and wrote a song about Williamsburg, and they tied it all together.
there you go, full circle.
That didn't make
Um,
it in there. Do you know what I'm talking about?
yeah, I know that song. Yeah, yeah. So why do you think that emo was able to break into the mainstream when it did, and could it ever happen again?
Um, I'll answer the second part first because I think about this stuff a lot, and in a way, I feel like it might be already in the mainstream in another like I don't know, like we of course say the word wave, people like us. But I feel like in the minds of like a 14-year-old now, emo is back in the mainstream again. And it might be hard for someone my age to really wrap their head around because I think we get used to trends and things resurfacing in familiar ways after a certain amount of time. And the trends sometimes the deck gets shuffled and trends come back in different ways. So basically, like in the mid 2000s, like we were saying, punks wouldn't call MCR emo or they wouldn't call Paramore emo. It was just, it was rock music or it was pop or whatever. And it was like these young kids or like people from England who were calling it emo, and people felt like the term was getting like bastardized. But now everyone's sort of like come around and they're like, yeah, you're right. No, and man, it's like, I'm not really a fan. I mean, I'm not really a fan of Machine Gun Kelly's music or the very many different iterations of Machine Gun Kelly, like Young Blood or something. But part of me does wonder, some of that stuff I like, not Machine Gun Kelly too much specifically, but there's some stuff in that general like Travis Barker, John Feldman world that I can get down with. But part of me wonders like, is that just the new version of like major label pop stuff that older people don't think is emo, but like 10 years from now everyone's just like, oh, this is emo, where like maybe emo did go back underground in the 2010s and it'll get looked on in the 2020s as being mainstream again.
I can't tell you how many times I've like reckoned with that exact like thought process, like where I'm just like, wait, like if I'm saying like, young blood is like just whatever bullshit, like am I doing the same thing that the people who acted like my chem didn't exist did? Like probably, like um but at the same time, to use like that armor for sleep thing as a parallel, like I think what we meaning like people who write about music on the internet that are not teenagers anymore. I think what we forget is like kids who are getting into music and but having their passionate moment now, like it's not like whoever is like really popular that we think is leading the trend. You know what I mean? If you go see like Origami Angel, you're gonna see 700 kids with X's on their hands losing their fucking minds. I don't think they care about like who got best new music this week. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that we might see like when they're 25, they're going to be like Origami Angel is the most important band of all time. And I don't know, but
Yeah, that's cool. Like, do you think there's bands now who are more of like in the traditional like punk band with guitars mold, not so much the pop stuff, like now, who you think could be like that band?
like actually like my chem big or
Not
like
not that
Thursday big.
not that big, but like thought of in 10 years in that sort of like a special space, the way, people like us think about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think like just off the top of my head, I think Origami Angel and Pool Kids for sure. I think you already really see it. Even just like not exactly emo, but I kind of feel it with Pink Shift.
Cool.
I kind of feel it with Hot Mulligan. I think there's definitely like a group of bands. I mean, it's just like, history repeats itself. And it's like, I remember 10 years ago going to see Modern Baseball and being like, whoa, like there's teenagers here reacting the way I reacted to Taking Back Sunday, and then now fast forward 10 years, you go see Pool Kids and it's like, whoa, they're reacting to this the way I saw people react to Modern Baseball and the way I reacted to Taking Back. You know what I mean? Like, so I think that they're out there for sure.
Yeah, that's cool. Like Pink Shift has been getting on some cool tours lately. They were just at a Jason Fest where we both were last weekend. Trying to think if there's anyone else. Pool Kids makes a lot of sense. I really liked their most recent album.
I think that band Sweet Pill, they're like on the way. Have you heard them?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see like next record for them really hitting. And I mean, I think if I'm not mistaken that Haley Williams has like co-signed them, so it's got to
Hmm.
help, I'm sure.
the Haley Coast and Help the Pool Kids.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, she's like, you know her podcast, right? Like everything is emo.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super like relevant to this conversation. I mean, I love that she is just basically like arguing about emo is stupid because everything's emo and like Block Party's emo, and I'm like, yeah, tell people Block Party's emo, totally. So one of the things I also really liked in your book was, I think it was Adam from the Academy is who talked about around 2006 there being this big clash of like between the early 2000s emo and then everything that was going to come after that. That is like really cool to read about for me because I definitely pinpoint '06 as like, and I don't really want to spend time talking about like Devil and God and stuff, but like I think that also like it signaled that sea change a bit and like you saw bands fall on one side or the other. I thought it was cool that you touched on that.
Yeah. I mean, also Max Bemis in I think a similar part of the book was just like, yeah, the dividing line was Fall Out Boy. The bands who came after Fall Out Boy were like, okay, it's cool. Let's go with like the pop. You know, we came from pop punk or hardcore, and we can sprinkle that in, but we can go pop because Fall Out Boy did it. It's cool. Whereas the bands who were before Fall Out Boy, you know, like your Get Up Kidses of the world, a lot of like other Vagrant bands were more like, oh, we got to go make some indie rock. Um, yeah, I feel like both Panic and yeah, the first Panic record in '05, Fever, and Fall Out Boy in general, just the way Pete embraced being a celebrity and being friends with Jay-Z and all that came with it. You basically went into either side, and that gets to be how you have the scene almost totally splintering from its roots, but then also the scene just going back to basics with the kids who are just like, no, that they probably just felt like, oh, that just feels so unattainable. So let's just start a band that sounds like American football or something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I also really love that you have a whole chapter on Pretty Odd because one, that album is just wild that it exists, and I feel like they're like a little bit caught between like what we're talking like because they are the so emblematic of following the Fall Out Boy route, and then they were like, oh, we smoke weed now and we made a Beatles record, like so that I feel like they kind of ended up like trying to be cool, trying to be indie.
Yeah. And for a minute, it looked like it was going to work because, like, 9 in the Afternoon at first felt like a hit song. Like, I remember it being on MTV and stuff. I remember, like, seeing the video of them, like, marching around. But the album pretty much had no traction and it fell off. And not long after, John Walker and Ryan Ross left the band. And it's funny, I never liked the album too much. I think 9 in the Afternoon is a nice song. There's some, you know, like Ryan sings on the album lead, which he didn't do much in Panic. That's cool. For me, it's kind of like, if I want to listen to that, I'll listen to the Beatles or the Zombies if I really want that sound. But yeah, like talking to the members of the band, talking to Rob Mathis, who produced the album, was interesting. Jonathan Daniel, who managed basically like all those Decadence bands. Um, yeah. On the topic of Panic and Pretty Odd in particular, I really enjoyed the opportunity to highlight Ryan Ross in the book because you Panic became something totally different, but in the early days of Panic, when you know when they were this thing that people couldn't stop talking about, you know, the I Write Sins days, Brendan was singing the words, but Ryan Ross wrote pretty much all of those vocals, wrote all those lyrics, and they were about some pretty heavy topics. And Ryan was like, in a lot of ways, you know, the machine behind that band, and I think to a certain faction of Panic fans, that's well known. The Panic fans who, in any sort of Panic at the Disco post, will just be like, Ryan Ross, don't forget Ryan Ross. But I think a lot of people probably picking up the book won't really be like familiar with that. So yeah, Ryan Ross, pretty important guy, and I definitely enjoy some Panic here and there. There's at least one or two songs on every one of their albums I can get behind, but I revisited Fever a lot in writing the book, and that album still feels really special. That feels like a classic to me.
I definitely agree with that. Yeah, I'm one of those big Ryan Ross fans.
Okay.
I'm glad he got his flowers in the book because, like, I don't know, like it became Brendan's solo project. They became like straight up pop music. I mean, I kind of dig High Hopes for what it is. I don't think it has anything to do with emo or hardcore. Not that Pretty Odd does, but I feel like Ryan was he's like the nerd in the band that I relate to, and Brendan's like the
Okay.
star that I don't, like so.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think maybe I
um,
relate to Spencer, who's the one who just works a desk job now,
that makes sense.
who works for Crush Music,
hmm
and is just
Yeah,
like talking to me like a guy who talks on Zoom all day when I'm on like my 80th Zoom interview for the book.
that's funny. You ever listen to that band, the Young Vanes? Was like
A couple
Ryan.
times.
Yeah, not so good, honestly. But I tried rooting for him.
Mm. Yeah,
So
I remember getting both the Young Veins. I think they just did an EP. I don't even know if they did a full length. But when I was at the radio station at TCNJ, I remember getting Pretty Odd. Like we didn't play it, but I remember like listening to the advance and being like, "Huh, Panic at the Disco." Also, it came out 3 years after Fever, which for back then, I mean, when you're a band that appeals to young people, 3 years, like someone who was like a sophomore when Fever came out, they were in college by the time the sophomore album dropped. So like that also probably had to do why Pretty Odd wasn't the album that they had hoped.
yeah, and they were so young too. Like it makes sense. I mean, like I'm looking this up so I don't get it wrong, but like Ryan Ross was born in 1986, so he would have been like 19 on the first record and 22 on the second. Like, yeah, that's hugely different places in your life.
Yeah, and yeah, also the age of these people is something that's you took it for granted back then because every band in the scene was like you would read like a 20 something person write about these bands and they're like and they're so young, they're still in high school. As another high schooler, I just kind of took it for granted. But going back and writing a book on this stuff, I really got to think about like, man, if I was 18 years old and went from just like playing in a band with my friends to other friends and was all of a sudden getting these people way older than me telling me about like, oh, you can be on MTV and you can make this much money and sell all these records. I don't know what effect that would have had on me, but I'm sure it would have fucked with my head so much. And like, I don't know how I would have turned out. And, you know, a good amount of people in these bands were very forthcoming about what it was like for them to have just gone through a whirlwind of emotions attached to fame and drugs, which they often used to just deal with the shit they were going through back then. And, a lot of that was such an important part of the story that couldn't really be overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I've definitely spent a lot of time thinking about that too. Like, I have no idea what it would feel like to be 18, 19 years old and you go from like local shows at VFW halls to like you're on MTV, you're playing to thousands of people at Warped Tour. Like it seems like nearly impossible to imagine.
Yeah, and like if you're the sort of person who's prone to anxiety, that would probably get heightened. Or if you're like the sort of creative person who gets kind of gassed up when you get a little bit of attention, imagine what it would feel like to have one huge album that people love and then you put out a second album when you're still like 20 and people hate that album and they're hating it publicly all over the internet and to your face even. Like what would that do to you? Like, I think sometimes it's easy to just take shots at famous people, which can be fun and funny. But talking to them in real time so many years later, you just see like, yeah, this roller coaster really fucked with people. And a lot of it I think was unique to that era. like because the internet was so new, and because bands from these like VFW hall shows weren't used to getting that kind of acclaim, and in some ways they can't again because MTV is nowhere as big as it will never be as big as it was again. No one will ever sell albums again like they were doing in 2003, you know? So in some ways like the era could never uh happen again. And in a lot of ways it's a bummer because I want to see creative people make money off their art, make a living off their art, but God, not get their heads fucked with in the way that some people were.
Yeah. And I mean, not to like go down a really dark path, but like, like, I mean, if we're talking about Lil Peep, like, I mean, it's,
Yeah. Yeah, getting Wikiphase, Adam McElwee, to chat for the book felt really, really special. I really value the quotes that are in the epilogue of the book because I don't go deep on Lil Peep and Goth Boy Click, but they felt really important to mention in talking about where emo went after the years of my book. And I really wanted the book to be the sort of thing that 10 years from now could still feel like, oh, this is the authoritative book. Like, this doesn't feel dated. So I was really kind of picky with what stuff from the 2010s and beyond that I included. And one of the things I just felt like so important was what started with Adam and Goth Boy Click. You know, him leaving Tiger's Jaw and making music that's kind of emo, but to beats. And like, the quotes at him and also a couple journalists, Marianne Eloise and Hannah Ewens, who interviewed Peep around that time. Also Will Yip, who's in that section of the book. Yeah, their contributions, like I really appreciate them.
yeah, for sure. No, it's definitely an awesome epilogue. And I think you picked good. I mean, even like I remember the first time I heard like Lucid Dreams by Juice World on the radio in like an Uber, which is the only time I really hear radio. um, I
Mhm.
was like, whoa, like there's a emo song playing, like, and so yeah, that probably is the most popular emo song of the last like 7 years. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, and talking about where now this discussion when you asked about like could emo get that big again, like in the 2020s, it feels like in a lot of ways it did have one of those moments. You know, it's just like it's so sad that some of the stars weren't able to come out on the other end.
Yeah, for sure. Now, on that note, what do you make of all like the nostalgia for this era that we're going through? Like we kind of touched on when we were young and like emo night, the emo's not dead cruise. I mean, the My Chem tour was like one of the biggest rock tours of the last few years. Um, there's clearly a lot of interest right now the timing is great for the book too. So I guess what are your thoughts on all of this stuff just having this like nostalgia moment, I guess?
I mean, I'm just really trying to enjoy it in the moment. You know, being at Adjacent Fest last weekend and you know seeing Senses Fail in early November and Thursday and Paramore, especially a bigger band like Paramore and also MCR when I was at their shows and seeing the crowd, and so much of it is like kids who are teenagers. It's like there's no way these people were around when the band was first big. Like these people reconnected with stuff that was big when I was a teenager. And it really does feel meaningful. Like 18-year-old me couldn't have really processed this, but it feels really meaningful when kids who are also passionate about pop culture and passionate about music and you like kind of like your kind of music when they resonate with the shit that you were into when you were a kid. Um so with all the nostalgia stuff, yeah, a lot of it can get corny. Man, like when people like I always thought people saying people putting plural on emo and calling themselves emos, that was just kind of like a no-go for me even when I was a kid. Like we would joke and call ourselves emo kids, but like scene kids was always cooler. But I don't know. I feel like the adult emos, the elder emos, it's so corny. But I'm not gonna be the one to really hate on it. if you're if you're if you're helping these people, not just the MCRs and the Paramores, but helping like bands of all shapes and sizes make a living and go tour and sell merch and share their stuff at this juncture, I think that's cool. And who knows how long this resurgence will last. Like I was saying before, there's all these patterns with pop culture where I think we expect like, okay, this amount of years later, the nostalgia cycle kicks in, and then the nostalgia cycle ends. But maybe this nostalgia cycle just keeps going on. I mean, like, look at how long people have been like loving Nirvana as teenagers. So who knows? I'm just trying to be in the moment with all the stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good point because I it does feel surreal to me when I see somebody like into my chem who would have been like a child when Three Cheers came out, but I'm like, well, I'm into Neverminds and I was born that year and it doesn't feel weird at all. So yeah, like maybe Ultra Girl was right. They're the new Nirvana.
Yeah, it's so funny how much that phrase got thrown around,
Yeah.
and now I feel like if you talk to like just average teenagers, so many of them would call Nirvana an emo band.
Yeah. I
I
have
think
not
so.
experienced that, but that's wild.
Yeah, I feel like to a lot of people, like emo just means like rock music that's not the Beatles, or like rock music that's not classic rock, or rock music that's kind of angsty in some way.
Hmm. Maybe
I
that's why I like Nirvana so much.
don't know.
So I also wanted to ask you, um, obviously when you do a book like this, you have to pick a timeline, but obviously any movement in like pop culture history, music history, it's never exactly this year to that year. So what made you say 99 to '08?
Yeah, so actually originally when I was in the proposal phase, it was, I believe it was '01 to '08. And I was still talking about a lot of the late '90s stuff, but it was in it was the first section, and I think I was calling it a prologue. But then it's like, oh, this prologue has 6 chapters. So, like, why is this a prologue? And there was so much good stuff in there. And as far as the timeline goes, I think the first albums that really hinted that emo could be a mainstream thing came out in '99. They were Through Being Cool and Get Up Kids, Something to Write Home About. I can't say that for sure because I was 10 in 1999. So for the early stuff in the book, I just really try to do my due diligence and spent a lot of time talking to people who were older than me and in the scene then. But from all the stuff I've read and over the years, it really does feel like those 2 albums were like the ones that made it poppy enough, cute enough that people heard the choruses and they were like, okay, yeah, this could move. So even though there was like there are definitely other emo bands who were, that had some hype for sure prior to '99, but for the most part, in a way that made sense for putting it together for a narrative, '99 felt like that year.
It's like fascinating how like I agree with you. Through Being Cool and Something to Write Home About are like arguably the first two like let's say third wave emo albums. But it's funny how that exact year is like Clarity and American Football self-titled, which is like maybe
Mm.
the last two second wave emo it's like in the same like yeah, anyway.
Yeah, it's like because I always wonder where the waves end and begin, because like those bands straddle. Well, I would think of like American football definitely second wave, even though like they're at the tail end of the '90s. Whereas like I would think of Get Up Kids maybe more as, or at least part of third wave, or Jimmy Eat World also, and they actually started way earlier. Um, but yeah, I guess you could say that American football is another one of those bands that would have been really cool to get in the book, but even though they're so important, they weren't. I mean, they weren't part of the scene that did the book on for sure. And even though like I get into Chicago a lot with Fall Out Boy, like the whole Champaign Urbana scene really seemed like it was something different from the hardcore scene that Fall Out Boy came from. But actually, I do have something in the works on second wave emo, another oral history that will be dropping in a couple weeks, maybe by the time you post this. So stay tuned for that. But it's not an American football, but something similar. But yeah, Clarity, talking about 99, yeah, Clarity I do get in the book, kind of as a prelude to Bleed American. Can't forget Clarity with 1999 as well.
Yeah, Jimmy Eat World's an interesting one because it's like, I feel like Clarity is arguably the best second wave emo album, and then Bleed American is like arguably the big bang of third wave emo. So same band.
Yeah. And with ending the timeline of the book, 2008 felt like the end of an era. The neatest way to wrap it up was Fall Out Boy putting out Folie à Deux. It's hyped up a lot because it's the next Fall Out Boy album. They're in their pop phase, but it's kind of a flop. A few months in, it definitely seems like a flop. They're not getting good reception on their tour. You know, the last scene of the book before the epilogue is, well, I won't spoil it, but I think it's something that very much sums up the end of mainstream emo. And, you know, at the time, MCR was kind of at odds with how to follow up Black Parade. They kind of soft launched this garage rock album that was like this back to basics Stooges influence project that wasn't going to be a concept album, but then they pulled away and wound up doing Danger Days, which I mentioned in the book, and that could be another book in and of itself, but Danger Days feels part of something else later on. And so even though some of these bands from the book wound up doing interesting things later on beyond '08 really felt like the moment where emo as just a big pop culture signifier started, where the scene, where all that started to wane in mainstream exposure.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So, anything else you feel like you want to add about the book?
No, I mean, just want to thank like just all the people who interviewed for me. Um, like it just means so much that, you know, after so many years of writing for publications, doing something on your own, you really get what it's like where you're like, oh wow, this person's talking to me not because like a publicist or manager put them in touch with Billboard or something. Like, oh, this person is actually just like giving their time to chat for 2 hours about tours they went on in 2003. And yeah, there were so many great subjects in the book, and even outside of the big famous people, a few just come to mind as really, really open people, and people who not only had great memories but just can look back on their time in the spotlight with a lot of reflection and putting things into context with some great stories. And for that, Adam Siska, bass player from the Academy, comes to mind. Buddy Nielsen from Census Fail is hilarious throughout the book. Aaron Gillespie from Under Oath, those people, and also Anthony Ranieri from Bayside. Bayside was a band who I fucking love. Bayside. They were one of the bands where I was just like, yo, I'm getting a chance to just like write my own book on emo and kind of can call the shots. I'm going to put Bayside in there a lot. Those people are all great interviews. It was hard to not have them in the book even more. So some of the bands that I think kind of fall between the cracks of stuff that was really popular in a pop way or stuff that kind of got remembered in an underground way. These kind of in-between bands that put out like gold records, but still kind of don't get talked about enough, you know? Bands like Census Fail, Under Oath. Getting them some shine in the book was really fun.
Awesome. Well, this has been a blast. Thanks so much, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, psyched to be on the podcast.
Yeah, psyched to have you. Hey, thanks so much to Chris. Thanks again for listening. Go pick up Chris's book, Where Are Your Boys Tonight? The Oral History of Emo's Mainstream Explosion, 1999 to 2008, out now on HarperCollins. And if you like what you heard, please give us a good review, rate, subscribe, tell your friends about us. It's all little stuff and it really goes a long way, and we really appreciate it so much. Thanks so much. See you next time.